Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be discussing my argument and the case for why we should believe, as historians, as responsible historians, that St. Thomas the Apostle went to India to evangelize the gospel of Jesus after his death, and then was killed in India by the king, therefore making him one of the apostles martyred. So for some people, this is like a topic not really discussed. If you're not familiar with New Testament scholarship, you probably don't know that the idea of how many apostles were martyred is a very contentious topic. Most critical scholars, I really can't think of one that will deny that three apostles were martyred. Those being Paul, Peter, and James, the brother of Jesus. Okay. Peter and Paul were both killed in Rome. James was killed in Jerusalem. Now, the other apostles is where it gets very, very murky. The historical record, you really only find text about a lot of the apostles being martyred 3-4 centuries after the death of Jesus, right? So historians have this idea known as living memory, and I mean, depending on perhaps how conservative or liberal of a historian, you might say that living memory is either shorter or longer. So I tend to put living memory about 100 years, 100 to 150 years after the event, because of the boatload of scholarship in the last 20 years, which has shown us that oral traditions in antiquity, in a society where you are more likely to hear something rather than read it, are very trustworthy. So that's a whole other topic altogether. But I put living memory around 100 to 150 years. 150 is kind of a stretch. But a lot of the texts that say that the apostles were martyred, Matthew's martyrdom, stories of Bartholomew's martyrdom, stories of Andrew's martyrdom, stories of Matthias's martyrdom, and so on. These are very late, and late 3rd century, 4th century. I think Matthew's even is 5th century is our earliest record of Matthew's martyrdom. So these texts are very just trustworthy, like a priori, in the sense that on first look, very late attestation, we should probably not trust them, right? Unless we have earlier sources, or we have a really good oral tradition strain that we can draw through the whole text. Maybe there's a lot of examples of Semitisms or Aramaisms, where you see a word that is from Hebrew or Aramaic in a text that is written in a different language, and that word is not changed, right? We see that a lot in the Synoptic Gospels with Abba, Abba, Father, Father, and stuff like that. So when we get further away from the 1st century, from the early days of the Jesus movement, we start seeing much less Aramaisms and Semitisms. There are some exceptions to that, but that's a general statement that I think everyone will agree with. So with all that said, Thomas has been a very researched figure, right? Because he's super underrepresented in the Synoptic Gospels, those being Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The first time that Thomas speaks is in John's Gospel. He's mentioned in the disciple list in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but he does not speak. There is no record of him speaking in those Gospels. The first time he speaks is in John. And as many people know, he takes on a very big role in John. I mean, he's the doubting Thomas, right? Jesus after his resurrection is, Thomas, put your hand in my wound, in the side of my rib, right? And this is to show Thomas that Jesus has really resurrected. It's a very apologetic move to show that Jesus has really resurrected, right? So Thomas takes a huge role in John's Gospel, but scholars by and large see that John's Gospel is the least likely to be historic, the least likely to be authentic recollections of what happened in the life of Jesus, right? That's just because it's very late. It was written in the 90s, right? And so we're dealing with a text that is largely removed from the early Jesus movement. But even then, of course, there are many strands of oral tradition and the Synoptic Gospels that I believe John knew. Certainly, he knew Mark and Matthew. But again, these are other topics, and this is what happens when you dive into New Testament scholarship. You can fall down a rabbit hole, and there's no end. But getting back to the point at hand, Thomas is not mentioned much, right? And we really don't really hear about him a lot. We have a couple of texts attributed to Thomas. We have the Gospel of Thomas, we have the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, and we have some very late texts other than that. But both those texts were written around the 2nd century. Gospel of Thomas was written closer to the start of the 2nd century, around like 120, 125, 130, maybe that type of range. Very debated topic, but we don't see Thomas taking a huge role, right? And so why am I talking about Thomas? Well, there is a either late 2nd century or early 3rd century text known as the Acts of Thomas that was not written by Thomas, obviously, but records the martyrdom and journey to India that Thomas did. Now, there are many stories about apostles traveling places. There's a story of Joseph of Arimathea, the one who was a member on the Sanhedrin Council and had a special tomb for Jesus. This is discussed at the end of John. Him. There is a record in church tradition that he went to England and founded the English church there. It's not impossible that an apostle went to England because of the ability of roads that were largely built in the decades before Jesus, in the decades during Jesus' time, extending from Rome all the way to Britain, right, which was a Roman province at this point. But this is a late claim that Joseph of Arimathea did this. But when it comes to the Acts of Thomas, there's just something so peculiar about this, right? So the Acts of Thomas states that there was a journey conducted around 50, AD after death. So 50 years, we're talking 20 to 18 years, 18 to 20 years after the death of Jesus, right? And the text records that his martyrdom occurred around like 70 AD. So the idea is that, the Apostle Thomas went to India around 50 and died around 72. So the most ancient church in India, our archaeological record of Indian Christianity, dates back to the late 1st century. So this is sort of a terminus date, you can say. Christianity made it to India before the end of the 1st century. That is undisputed, okay? The question then becomes, how did Christianity make it to India, and was Thomas the one to do that? I think he was, so I'm going to give my case here. So I say that Thomas landed on India's shores around 50 CE. Perhaps there was an early journey done in 40 CE, but he did not make it all the way to modern India. He maybe made it to Pakistan, right, the Indian subcontinent in the ancient understanding, right? But I don't think that Thomas made, if he had an earlier journey in 40 AD or CE, he did not make it all the way to India, but he did in 50 AD. So I think he sailed from Alexandria to India for a couple of reasons. We consistently see Alexandria and Indian Christian relations throughout the early church, like really positive relations, like super weird that, Alexandria in Egypt is a little far from India, right? But very, very strong relations. And I think that if Thomas were to have sailed from Alexandria, as the Acts of Thomas reports, it makes much more sense why these relations were maintained for so long and the desire in the first place for such relations, right? If you knew that the person who came to evangelize your land was from a certain area, or sailed from there rather, you would want to establish a good relation with that area. And so I think that just off the bat is good evidence that specifically Thomas sailed from Alexandria rather than anywhere else. Another really good piece of evidence, taking out the archaeological side of things, is that there To this day, there are a group of Christians known as St. Thomas Christians in India, and they're split into members of the Oriental Orthodox churches and then the Maronite Catholic churches. So many of them are located in South India, like these churches that call themselves St. Thomas Christians. Mar Thomas, because the Aramaic word mar can mean like leader or master, right? So they're saying these are they're basing themselves on the idea that their master is Thomas. Okay, so yeah, there's many places that say, Armenia has this where they say Bartholomew established their church, right? But why should we think this is any different? Well, there's a couple of reasons. Because the Acts never record Thomas visiting South India. And this lends much more credibility to their claim that these St. Thomas Christians in South India descend from Thomas, considering that it seems to be spurred by an independent oral tradition, right? It shows that Thomas's travels in India were much further and more expansive than his name is reported in this late 1st century, early 2nd century gospel, right? So that kind of lends credibility to their claim, because if you are, it's the early church and you're trying to establish, you have apostolic authority for your land and your church, right? So you say, well, this apostle traveled here and established a church here, and you base yourself off of a already existing document, likely with earlier oral traditions, but you base yourself off an already existing document which says that X apostle traveled here, right? Well, when we look at Acts, we don't see that. We don't see Thomas ever visiting South India, yet those St. Thomas Christians are in South India. So that's a very good reason to think that, this lends credibility to their claim that they descended from St. Thomas. Another one is that there are no contradictory claims in the literary record of Indian Christianity that it was not Thomas. There is no one like, actually, Matthew came here. We do see that in later traditions. We see this, I can't remember the exact areas of the Roman Empire, but we see examples of Matthew. Some traditions say, yeah, he went to, let's say, Ephesus, or yeah, he went to Armenia. Those aren't exact. I'm just giving examples of faraway areas that, different texts, different oral traditions say that somebody went to. We don't see that for Thomas. We only see Thomas going to the Far East. India and later traditions claimed Indonesia and China too, though those are perhaps less believable. But I don't discount them altogether. Regardless, the fact that John's gospel written in the 90s is really the only time where we see Thomas's character and Thomas's narrative build would make sense if Thomas went to India, because only when other Christians made their way there, as shown, evidenced by that church that I mentioned that was there by the end of the 1st century, would they know about Thomas's story. John's gospel relied on perhaps those witnesses that knew Thomas and said, yeah, Thomas told us the stuff that he did with Jesus, right? Like Thomas was like, yeah, guys, I was the one who put my hand in Jesus' side. And Jesus was like, yeah, you really believe me now. And then I say, Lord, Lord, I believe in you, right? So it makes sense to think that Thomas truly was the person to do this, because John's gospel gives him the most emphasis, and it was written in the 90s, and only when other Christians made their way to India did they really encounter Thomas's story. So I think that's a really fascinating argument. And of course, that alone is no evidence. No historian should take that seriously, right? But when we take into the other arguments that I made into consideration, the case starts being built that Thomas truly evangelized India, as the ancient tradition says. Now, for some archaeological evidence, because, hey, I love archaeology, one of the most powerful archaeological claims is that in 1834, several documents found in the Kabul province bear the name of the first century Indian ruler Gondophares, right? I don't have the pronunciation of the ancient India languages, so my bad. Gondophares is my assumption. But what's fascinating is that the earliest attestation of this name was the Acts of Thomas. Okay, so the question then becomes, how does a text written in the late first century or the late second century or early third century, presuming it has no ties to any historical event where this apostle Thomas evangelized India, have knowledge about a first century Indian ruler where the only attestation in the entire historical record, I'm including secular sources, archaeological sources, we did not know that this guy was the ruler of India in the first century until they found these coins and documents in 1834. The only text that says he was in existence was the Acts of Thomas. So, how did a late second century, early century writer fabricate this guy's name out of thin air? Because that was the assumed thing, right? Before we found these documents, people that were skeptical and already doing, proto-critical scholarship in the 18th century before they found these coins were like, oh, Thomas added, the author of Thomas added the name Gondophares to his text because it gives credence to his tale, right? If you name somebody in your text, people that are reading it are like, yo, this guy really knows what he's talking about. But we found these coins that attest to this guy's name. So how did this random guy in the late second century, early third century know about this ruler? Well, if the tale is true, if the tale is not a tale, but a rough historical record of Thomas evangelizing India, and then passed down through oral tradition, it makes sense why they knew this. Another discovery that has emboldened this claim that Thomas was truly the one to evangelize India is the discovery of the Taxila cross in 1935 in the ancient Indian city of Sirkap. So, due to several archaeological discoveries in the 1850s, once we found out these coins were said Gondophares on it, I mean, scholars in the 1830s, 1840s were like exploding, like with joy. So many archaeological, excavations were conducted around the 1840s and 1850s, and that's how we learned that Salkap was the capital of India under Gondophares, right? So we discover these coins, then 1935, literally 100 years later, we discover a cross that was in the ancient city of the capital of India under Gondophares, which is again only known before 1834 through the Acts of Thomas. Okay. So, we have all this archaeological evidence to think that there's certainly a church established by the end of the first century. There are coins bearing the name of this guy, this ruler who ruled much of India, only known through the Acts of Thomas before 1834. Then we learned that there was a cross discovered in the capital of India under this ruler, Gondophares, where, and after Gondophares died, this capital, I believe the capital changed. So we discover that while Gondophares is alive, there is a cross there. We are already talking the 60s. We're already talking 60s, first century, 60s AD. So just archaeology alone, we are talking the 60s. The question then becomes, what is a more likely hypothesis? That there was an apostle, Thomas, who brought Christianity to India, and through his work there, established a church by the end of the first century, and much likely many more. It's very unlikely that he would just establish one church. We're probably going to find many more in the decades to come as we do more archaeological research in India about this, right? Why was a church there? Well, it would make sense that people would want to establish a church because an apostle came. And by the first century, we have a church, and by the 60s, we have a cross bearing, the symbol of Christianity, which is also a very important discovery for, people claiming that the cross was a later symbol in Christianity to represent the Christians, maybe some of those like iconoclastic evangelicals that don't like the idea of the cross. Well, we're looking at the 60s, and we already have that being used in a place established by an apostle, assuming that the evidence I put forth here is fair, that this was a symbol of Christianity. So evangelicals, stop hating the cross. St. Thomas liked it. Anyways, this is to say, kind of circling back, The other hypotheses, the alternative hypotheses for how we have a church by the end of the first century and how we have a cross, I'm not joking. Some people say that it's because of trade. Just because of trade, just trade. There is no other evidence. I'm not like we don't have like harbor records. We don't have like nautical records of this, that there was trade. We know there was trade between India and Alexandria and other parts of the Roman Empire, but the extent to that trade would have to be so powerful for there to be so much people, you know, thinking that I'm going to build a church here and I'm going to put a cross here and yeah, I'm going to start an oral tradition that St. Thomas came, but actually he didn't come. Um, yeah, so I think the evidence is extremely in favor of the idea that Thomas went to India and was martyred. However, I think that the evidence that Thomas went to India is still stronger than that he was martyred. Uh, Whether Thomas was martyred is really hard to prove. Certainly, the oral tradition, the Mar Thomas Christians, the Master Thomas Christians, they hold that Thomas was martyred. But we don't have any archaeological record for that, right? Um, but I think that because of the non-contradictory claims in these Christians, and again, this is extremely rare. We, I can't think of another example where there is a group of people outside of Palestine, Judea, Syrian Judea, claiming that they were established by the apostles who didn't say that it was more than one apostle or that some later generations came along and they said, actually, it was this apostle, not the ones that the earlier ones said. Only India fits this. And I think, considering all this evidence, that Thomas both evangelized in India and was martyred in India under Gondanfaris the king because he was disrupting the Hindu pantheon of gods and the imperial understanding of you venerate these gods, you worship these gods because these gods will protect your society when you go to war and will protect you and stop famines from coming and stop invaders and things like that. So yeah, I think that this is great evidence for Thomas, and I think that his critical scholars really, really, really need to re-examine their biases, because this is just really good evidence that we have at least 4 apostles who were martyred. Other than that, it gets complicated. I personally think 6 were martyred. 5 or 6. I don't think any more were martyred. I think that the apostles were persecuted after Jesus' death. That seems undeniable. But the idea that they were killed for the purpose of they were evangelizing Jesus' message, it's a very weak argument that the majority of the apostles were, or even that more than 6 were. And I say 6, I'm more probably 5. I'm more probably a 5 person that will say there's 5 apostles that were martyred. But regardless, that's a different topic altogether, and maybe I will revisit this another time. But I am very excited with my information I presented here. And of course, what was I reading off? I wasn't reading off someone else. I was reading off my own work, my own research. Of course, gathering evidence from various documents and various scholars, but compiled by myself and adding some further arguments and stuff. So I think that Christians should take pride in the idea that St. Thomas was truly did evangelize India, and that this oral tradition and that these Mar Thomas Christians are truly apostolic. I think that there are few churches that can say that they are truly apostolic, and Mar Thomas Christians certainly can. So that's really powerful from a spiritual perspective. So yeah. Anyways, I'm going to close the video with saying that this comes from my forthcoming book, Grace Abounds, which makes the case for Christian universalism in Orthodox Christianity. It is currently, it was accepted for publication at Wipf and Stock, and it is minus the bibliography. It's about 460 pages, 470 pages of text. I discuss the evidence for universalism in Scripture, in liturgical text, in apocryphal text, in the patristic period, and then make a philosophical case for it as well. And of course, discuss the ecclesial reception of universalism, which is such a fun and fascinating, controversial topic. This text is, it's gonna make headway. It's gonna make headway, and I'm excited for people to get their hands on it. Having received endorsements from the theologian John Milbank, big theologian and interviewed on this channel. He wrote a blurb for this book. Father Aidan Kimmel, who is the leading Orthodox priest, or the leading Universalist who is an Orthodox priest, and as well 6 other endorsers that I'm sure many people are familiar with those names. So I'm excited for this book, and I'm really excited for people to get their hands on it. It is going to be expensive because it is such a big book, about $50, $55, I believe. 45 to 55 is, I think, the estimate they're saying, but I'm really excited for people to get their hands on this and just to see the case for universalism and the case for a lot of other things too, like this, which is discussed in chapter 3. So I'm going to make a whole video once I get to, towards the final part of the production process for my book. But right now, I'm just kind of giving a teaser and explaining, just a random topic I really find fascinating. So thank you, everyone. Have a nice day. Subscribe for more New Testament scholarship, philosophy, theology, psychoanalysis, continental philosophy, the whole shebang. Thank you.